How about that? Yeah, okay. We'll do that. Okay, so thank you everyone so much. I just want to start off with saying a massive thank you and acknowledgement to the Indigenous peoples of Alaska for having us on their land. I spent a few days going around here, and it's absolutely incredible, absolutely beautiful, and it's such an honor to be here. So thank you. I also want to express my gratitude for this space. Thank you to Gina and the whole Arctic Visions team. Really just to acknowledge how important it is that we can all come together and have these really important and deep discussions at such a pivotal time as well. In today's talk, I'm not going to be speaking on behalf of Indigenous peoples. Rather, I'm going to be speaking as a student of curanderismo, a student of the Shipibo, who I've been training with over the last 10 years. And this talk isn't a blueprint. This isn't a blueprint in how to bridge these worlds. It's really an invitation to start this dialogue, which I think is really important. Okay, so we're going to start off with a little bit of background about how I came into this work, and then we're going to talk about some of the issues that I see with the medicalization of psychedelics. We're going to talk about how we can navigate these different knowledge systems, both Western medicine and traditional medicine, and I'm going to use some of the features of the Shipibo cosmology that I've learned through my training and apprenticeship to illustrate this. I'm going to make some suggestions about how we might be able to rethink research, how I've been trying to do it, and the shortcomings in the research that I've been doing. And then we're also going to talk about the don't do it without us pledge. So basically, I want to make an invitation to scientists to respond to some of the calls that Indigenous practitioners have been making, saying it's fantastic that you have this interest in our medicines, but don't do it without us. You don't know what you're doing. You're new to this kind of knowledge. And then I want to make some suggestions in how we might be able to shift these methodologies, these analyses, and actually change the questions that we're asking in order to answer that call. Okay, so I started my career as a medical doctor, as a psychiatrist. I always wanted to study psychiatry. I always wanted to be a psychiatrist. I found the mind infinitely fascinating, especially when its kind of so-called went wrong. I was particularly interested in psychosis. And when I eventually got through medical school and I started working as a psychiatrist, it was fantastic, and I loved it. I loved the patients, I loved the theory. But there was one real issue, and that was that a lot of the pharmacological treatments, a lot of the drug treatments that I was using just didn't seem to work that well. And it's not just me that thinks this, and there are many other psychiatrists that have said that we're in the middle of a crisis in psychiatry. Psychiatry is now more of a palliative specialty. It's known as the Cinderella of medicine, and psychiatrists are trying to fight that, trying to make it as medical as possible to address that. And so I decided to take a bit of a break from medicine, and I ended up traveling around the world. And by a stroke of luck or fate, however you want to think about it, I ended up in a cafe in Guatemala, sitting next to somebody who was training to be a curandero, somebody who was training with the Shipibo. And he was telling me all about the way that he'd been working with ayahuasca, telling me that he'd been using it to treat many of the conditions that I've been really struggling to treat in my own patients back home with great ease. And so, of course, I was completely fascinated by what he was saying, and I was particularly fascinated with the part where he was saying it's mainly through spirits. Yes, we give people ayahuasca, but it's actually a vehicle into the spirit world. It's actually spirits that are doing the healing rather than the actual chemicals within ayahuasca. I thought that this was quite an outlandish thing to say, quite a far-out thing to say, but I was intrigued enough as a young psychiatrist to go down to the Amazon rainforest with him, and I had my first experiences with ayahuasca. Needless to say, it was fantastic. I was really blown away by the effects that I saw on myself and on other people in the ceremonies as well, on the retreat. And so I started looking into the research that had been done into ayahuasca in the past. And there was some research that was looking into ayahuasca, mainly in Brazil, in syncretic churches, but there was relatively little research, scientific research, in the Amazon rainforest, apart from anthropological research. So this was 10 years ago, 2015. I tried to get some funding to do some research into ayahuasca, got immediately rejected by everyone, and ended up self-funding my first research project looking at ayahuasca and personality. Fortunately, following on from that, I did get some funding from the Medical Research Council, which is part of the UK government. And we conducted the first ever study looking at any psychedelic and epigenetics, as well as looking at common mental health conditions as well. The research that we were doing continued to snowball. I formed the not-for-profit on Naya that do research based in the jungle. Ended up doing a PhD into Amazonian ayahuasca and mental health outcomes. And somewhere along the way, 6 years ago, started training in Shipibo curanderismo, so started training to be a shaman as well, to try and get an idea of how medicine was working from both of these different angles. And that's really impacted the way that I see the world, the way that I see healing, and the way that I see the universe at large. So most of the research that we do is based in the Amazon rainforest in Peru. We can see it here. And we're based in a community called the Mashana community, which is a group of about 100 indigenous peoples about a day away from Iquitos in the Amazon rainforest, which is one of the big cities. And this is Riosbo Research Center, which is where we conduct most of our research. And our latest research that we're doing is in collaboration with a charity called Heroic Hearts. We're looking at veterans with PTSD, and we're assessing them in terms of all of their trauma, in terms of PTSD, in terms of epigenetics, gut microbiome, cognitive tasks, EEG, looking at brain waves. So it's really multimodal, the research that we're doing. And so far, we've got some really fantastic results. At the moment, we're seeing that over 80% of veterans at 6-month follow-up no longer meet our criteria for PTSD, which is fantastic. And this is Don Rono Lopez, who is the Shipibo curandero that I've been apprenticing under over the last 6 years, is when I started doing it more seriously. Okay, so I just want to start off by talking a little bit about the so-called psychedelic renaissance. And we've heard a bit about this in some of the other talks. So as we've seen, psychedelics are beginning to go mainstream, which is really exciting for many different people. There's been a massive increase in research, a huge increase in media attention, which is both good and bad. And there's also a lot of investments into this area in early stage startups and biotech pharmaceutical companies. Now, this is a moment of great potential for many people who feel failed by the Western medical system. But at the same time, there are some real issues with this movement. So there's a real risk of repeating extractive models, especially with indigenous peoples. So science has a really terrible track record of doing this, of just taking medicines that aren't them and then medicalizing them, and then performing horrendous acts on indigenous peoples alongside of that. But the thing that I'm most interested in, and the thing that I want to talk about today, is the impact that ignoring indigenous knowledge could have both on the safety and efficacy of the treatments that we're using. So I think that all of the ethical aspects are fantastic, and there are great organizations like Shakruna that are addressing these things. But it's really surprising to me that barely anyone is talking about the efficacy of these medicines. The fact that indigenous peoples have been using these for hundreds, if not thousands of years, they say they know how to use them, and most scientists are ignoring that. They're not taking what they say seriously. So what's missing in Western science? So first to say, I'm a scientist primarily, my background, I think science is fantastic, but at the same time, Western research often tries to isolate symptoms. It's obsessed with doing that. It tries to cut everything out that can't be quantified. Now, when you look at indigenous traditions like the Shipibo, you can't dislocate that from spirit, community, and land. This is all part of the healing. These aren't additional extras that are added in. These are actually foundational to the treatment themselves. You can't remove these traditions from these aspects. And when you ignore these things, you can't understand the practices. It doesn't work in the same way. Carl Rutt was talking about this the other day. We can't remove shamanism from its context. It just doesn't function in the same way. So, Western science is brilliant, but it is also rooted in specific values. It tries to control everything, it tries to measure everything, and it tries to predict these things. And this in itself isn't a bad thing. This is actually a fantastic thing. Science is a fantastic methodology, but unfortunately it has become a dominant belief system rather than this method. It assumes that what we measure is real, and if we can't measure it, then it can't be real, and actually objectivity is the highest form of truth. Now, this is actually the complete opposite, at least in my experience, of indigenous healing systems, which are really based on the subjective. What was the experience that you had? What happened to you? Can you describe it? It doesn't matter about these objective things. You describe what happened to you, and that is the most important thing. So we need to remember that Western science is a fantastic way of knowing, but it is not the only valid way. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about these different knowledge systems. So I'm going to use the Shipibo tradition as an example of an indigenous knowledge system so that we can understand what traditional knowledge systems look like very kind of vaguely. So many indigenous, or at least Amazonian traditions, are based on this concept of animism, so that everything is alive, everything has this spirit. And this is plants, most people have heard of the spirits of plants, water, rocks, but it's actually everything. So for example, this table would have a spirit. Agua Florida, which is used in ceremonies, this kind of chemical alcohol water, also has a spirit. Shamans get to know that spirit in order to use it in ceremonies. So absolutely everything has a spirit. And in this paradigm, plants are teachers. They're not just substances that you take. So that changes the way that you interact with them, because they're no longer the medicine that you're working with. They're actually an active teacher. Now, these things, these indigenous knowledge systems, they don't need to be proven with Western science in order to be valid. They've been practiced and refined for generations, and in their own way are already valid. So we don't need to put them into a Western scientific framework. So, in the terms of Shipibo, healing takes place by restoring people to right relationship. So, when I started apprenticing under Don Rono, I was pretty surprised that he actually very rarely spoke about healing. He would just always refer to bringing everything back into balance, bringing everything back into harmony, bringing everything back into alignment. And he spoke about this on 3 different planes. So he said that the first plane that you start off, that you need to be aware of, is the spiritual plane, the spiritual dimension. And if you're out of balance on the spiritual plane, most Western people might be able to notice something's a little bit off, but they might not know what it is. And if you don't address that, then it begins to manifest on the next plane, which is the psychological and the emotional plane. And if you're out of balance there and you don't address that, then it's going to start to manifest as anxiety and depression and all of these conditions that we quite often see within our Western medical system. Now, if you don't address that, then it will begin to manifest physically, and you'll begin to get physical conditions. Now, obviously, this isn't true for all conditions, but for most conditions, this seems to be a very valid model and a way of understanding health and illness. So it's important to know that this is a worldview. It doesn't matter whether you believe in this or not. In the Amazon rainforest, this is what's happening. It's not a case of trusting or believing in spirits. This is just the case. And the way that we treat this in traditional medicine, at least with the Shipibo, is through songs, icaros, these traditional medicinal plants as well, and then the visions that you see within ayahuasca ceremonies. And these are the treatments that you use. So many of these indigenous traditions are languages of patterns. So we can see here on this slide the kuna, which are the visual representation of health and illness. And this is some of the kuna here. There are these squiggly geometric patterns that we see. And these really aren't just decorative motifs that are used by the Shipibo. They're actually more like a spiritual, in-depth, detailed, technological blueprint. So I would have my own kuna that represents me, who I am as a person, any imbalances that I have. But then also you have a kuna that links between different people. So for example, between myself and Beer, we would have a kuna that represents who we are as colleagues, who we are as our friendship. And if there's a distortion there, then that would be represented as a kuna. And then for the whole of this conference, there would be a kuna, this unique energetic pattern that represents who we are as Arctic Visions 2025. Now, the icaros are what are used to restore that alignment, these medicinal healing songs. And each of the icaros has their own energetic fingerprint, their own kuna associated with it as well. So this is the technology that you're using. So when we start thinking as plants as beings, the plants really become our teachers. Now, the cornerstone to training in shamanism, in lots of places all over the Amazon rainforest, but especially with the Shipibo, is master plant dietas. And so this involves going into isolation in the Amazon rainforest in a small hut called a tambo for weeks, months, and some of the old school Shipibos do years. And what you do is you starve yourself of everything. So you starve yourself of food, you starve yourself of water, any kind of social activity, any kind of sex, sexual thoughts, and you drink a small amount of plant, which is deemed by the Shipibo to be an enlightened being. And then you form a relationship with that spirit, and when you go into ceremonies, you're asking the spirit to heal on your behalf. So actually the way that shamanism works most of the time is that the shaman is a middleman asking spirits that he's made friends with, or she, to heal people on their behalf. So in this way, you're really learning from the plant as a teacher. You're not taking it. So it's a really different way to relating it. And this should really redefine how we think about medicine and how we think about research and how we conduct scientific studies. So according to the Shipibo, illness is actually a form of disconnection. And that can be caused by many different things. So it can be disconnection as a result of trauma, as a result of conflict, or as a result of our ancestry as well. And this has been reflected in our research with veterans. Most of the veterans are describing feeling disconnected from themselves, from their land, from the community, from their own mind, from who they are as a person. And so this really isn't just the symptoms that we're treating. It's actually a broken relationship. And we're just restoring that to harmony, and we're restoring it to balance. So the way that this works is that the shamans will try to retune the person's energetic system, their energetic field. And the role of the healer is actually to restore this balance. That's the main thing that they're doing, restoring the balance, the clarity, and the direction. But importantly, the plants are guiding the process when they're doing this. So the plants will teach the healer what to sing. There's a really interesting phenomenon when you train in shamanism, or at least with the Shipibo, that the plant will teach you a karo. So you get your own songs that come through visions, that come through dreams, and they'll be specific to the person that you're trying to treat. And as we said before, it's the spirits that are healing on behalf of the curandero. So one of the markers of a really great curandero is that they'll always say, at least in my opinion, it's the spirits that are healing, it's not me. And hopefully be humble. And one of the red flags would be if the person is saying, oh no, it's me who's healing people and it's not the spirits. Okay. So in this way, knowledge is really a relationship. It's not data that we're just collecting. The plants are not substances that we're using, like in clinical research. They're actually living beings, according to traditional knowledge. So this is a kind of knowledge that's really embodied, and it's felt, and it's intuitive. And in order to engage with this knowledge, it requires relationship with the spirits, relationship with the plants, relationships with indigenous peoples and the land. It also requires respect and reciprocity. You can't just come in and you can't just take it. Now, this isn't just a lesser way of knowing than science. It's just a different way. This is a different science within itself, one that we've largely been ignoring as Western scientists. We can't just extract the chemicals from the plants that we're using and leave all of the context. It requires the context for it to work. Without the relationship, these shamanic practices just don't function. So, as Western scientists, what is this actually asking of us? Now, I'm definitely not saying that we need to get rid of Western science. Not at all. I love Western science. I think it's fantastic. But what we need to do is to try and widen it. So can we actually slow down and listen to these indigenous communities that we're beginning to form relationships with? Can we actually begin to widen the scope of science? Can we hold these multiple viewpoints at once? And can we acknowledge that this is a different kind of rigor to be able to do that, to think about things from a different point of view, really respecting different ways of knowing? Now, this isn't about everyone adopting indigenous beliefs. I'm not expecting everyone to do that, not at all. But it's really about having the humility to take what indigenous peoples are saying seriously. So when people are saying things like concepts of plants, concepts of entities, not immediately assuming that it must be some kind of metaphor, it must be some kind of theology. But what would it mean for research to actually take these things as being serious? We also need to remember that our way is not the only way. Knowledge is plural, and really question, what does research look like when we're thinking that way? So, now I'm going to speak about bridging worlds, and everyone seems to say they're bridging worlds. Bridging worlds seems to be the slogan for pretty much every psychedelic startup I've come across in the last 10 years. But it's not theoretical, it's really a practice in order to do this. And so what does that actually look like? Well, for Western scientists, it requires us to be vulnerable and it requires us to be accountable. We need to acknowledge that we're going to pass into spaces where we might not know what the rules are. We're extremely good at following rules. We're extremely good at acknowledging that other people can make them within science and following those. But we need to know that when we're working with different people, when we're working with indigenous peoples, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to feel uncomfortable. But what really matters when we're starting this process is that we can stay in relationship, that we can acknowledge that we're wrong, and we can put ourselves in a position where we can learn and we can keep moving forward. Because what I've learned from working with the Shipibo over the last 10 years is that indigenous traditions, at least with the Shipibo, are ultimately about relationship. That's the fundamental thing. Relationship to ourselves, relationship to others, the land, spirit, community, the plants, is all about relationship. Okay. So we're going to think a little bit now about rethinking research. And I'm going to give some examples of how I've been trying to do this over the last 10 years. So one of the things that I created is something called the Indigenous Advisory Board. And these are a group of indigenous peoples who I work with. And we can see here on the top corner, we have Gemstone, who's indigenous Australian, Don Rono, who I introduced you to earlier today, who's Shipibo, Angela Lopez, who's Rono's sister, and Don Wildamawa as well. And all of these people I've had the honor and the privilege of working with. And so what we do is when we get funding for our research, and kind of as often as we can, we sit down with the Indigenous Advisory Board and we think about what we'd like to research together. So we come up with our ideas for the research, and then once we've collected all the data and we've analyzed it, then we interpret the results together, and then we disseminate these findings to the communities that we work with as best we can, which usually involves translating everything into Spanish, putting it into layman's terms, and then distributing it to the communities that we've been working with. So, in terms of creating the research questions, so here's a couple of examples of what we've been trying to do. So, when we sat down with Don Rono a little while ago and said, what would you like to research? He said he wanted to look at the relationship between plants and between humans. And I immediately thought, okay, how on earth are we going to do this? What would it look like to research that relationship? And we thought maybe a good way to do that, to look at the relationship between plants and humans, would be to look at the concept of nature-relatedness. So nature-relatedness is a concept that allows us to measure how connected people feel to nature, whether they feel at one with it, whether they feel that nature is God and they're a part of that, or whether there's a disconnect. And so we did that and we published it, and of course Rono is an author on that paper. And then following that we thought, okay, so that went quite well, what should we do next? So we asked Rono what he wanted to look at next, and he said that he wanted to look at the impact of different icaros, the medicinal healing songs, on the treatment of participants. So for example, he wanted to look at the different impacts that a healing icaro has on a protection icaro. And so I sat down with the Onaya team and thought, how on earth are we going to do this? How on earth are we going to begin to look at that? And so we thought long and hard, and we came up with the idea of EEG hyperscanning, which is when you get multiple EEGs and you put it on people all at the same time, and then you basically timestamp them and you see how their brainwaves change at the same time. And so what we ended up doing was recording Rono singing his icaros, translating it all into English, timestamping it, and then recording people's brainwaves within the ceremony, timestamping that, and then correlating the different icaros to the different changes in brainwaves to see when there was a healing icaro versus an EEG. And so this is us in the jungle doing that study when we thought we figured it out, and feeling quite happy about that. But then I had we never actually analyzed this data, because when we actually did this study, it's so difficult to know what's okay and what's not. There's no guidelines, there's no rule book as to what's acceptable and what isn't. And when we brought the EEG technology into the ceremonies in the jungle, For me, that just felt like a step too far. It felt like that technology shouldn't be there, and we were worried that it might open up the floodgates and that people would start bringing that technology into ceremonies, thinking that that was acceptable. So we ended up not analyzing that data in the end and decided to just keep doing our EEGs immediately before and immediately after the ceremonies in the nearby, our kind of makeshift research lab that we have in the jungle. But then after that, I was speaking to Rono, about the whole concept of EEG and explaining, those rugby caps that we have on everyone. They're looking at everyone's brainwaves, and that could be an indication of like what's happening with the Icaros. Rono turned to me and was like, "Yeah, Simon, yeah. The thing is, in ceremonies, I have caps on each of you in the spirit world, but you just can't see them. And mine are picking up on far more complex things than your electrical brainwaves, and mine are far superior to yours." And I was like, I can't really argue with that, that's true. But it got me thinking, are we actually looking at Icaros? Are we actually looking at the impact of Icaros when we're assessing EEG? That's the closest thing that I could think of that might be able to measure this spiritual technology. But I'm pretty sure that's not what Rono was referring to. Rono wasn't saying, do Icaros impact electricity in the brain? He's almost definitely going to be talking about something on the spirit world, where he is. He's talking about the impact on the kuna, the impact on balance, the impact on the energetic designs that makes up who we are in the spirit world. And so we have to ask the question, is science actually advanced enough to pick up on many of these technologies that indigenous peoples are using? Maybe it's not. Maybe science isn't the right technology to actually be doing this. Also, can science ask these questions? Can science come up with the correct questions? Or should we be looking to indigenous traditions to guide the research that we're doing? Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is interpreting different results. So another study that we were doing that actually formed the backbone of my PhD was looking at the impact of ayahuasca on epigenetic change. And we heard a fantastic talk from Candice earlier about epigenetics. And so we were doing this in the Amazon rainforest. It was actually the first time that any psychedelic had been looked at with epigenetic change. And we found that there was a change in expression in one of the genes that we were looking at. It was a preliminary study. And so I was explaining this, to Don Rono, and saying, we found this change, and epigenetics is this concept where the environment changes the expression of our genes, and there's some early stage research that it might be passed down through different generations. Rat studies are suggesting that that could last for about 13 different generations. There are these studies that are showing that children of survivors of the Holocaust are more susceptible to stress. Maybe it's kind of being passed down. And Rono's response to that was, of course you found that, Simon. Of course you found that in the study. We just call that cleaning ancestral lines. And I've been doing that to you in ceremony for the last 10 years. You just haven't known. And nobody else was surprised at all. I think I was the only person in the whole jungle that was surprised that there was an epigenetic change as a result of drinking ayahuasca. But this is my point, is that are we looking at the same thing but from a different point of view? Are we using different language to explain the same phenomenon? So now whenever we publish papers, when we give talks looking at these kind of results, we try to show different definitions, different interpretations of the way in which these phenomena could be explained. But so all of this is great, we've been trying to do this for the last 10 years and trying to bridge this gap between Western science and indigenous knowledge. But there's still a really big issue here, which is that we're trying to fit everything into a Western epistemology. We're trying to fit all of these indigenous concepts into a Western framework. We still use Western methods like epigenetic analysis, EEG, gut microbiome. We still publish in Western journals led by Western researchers, and we're still using Western metrics. And so one thing that's really been on my mind recently is what would it take to change that? What could it look like to think about things outside of a Western point of view, to really change the way that we approach science and to bridge that gap? Okay, so what might come next? So we talk a lot about decolonization, but I really want to question, what does decolonial research actually look like? What would it look like if Indigenous worldviews were actually shaping the research that we were doing? This isn't just about adding Indigenous voices into the work and into the research that we're already doing, and this isn't just about inviting Indigenous peoples into the Western structures. I'm actually talking about reshaping those structures and creating a new form of science, if we want to call it that. So we talk a lot about, or at least I have spoken a lot about, translating Indigenous concepts into Western terms, but maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe that's not appropriate. Maybe that's not an appropriate thing to do. What I do know is that this should begin with deep listening and long-term relationships with Indigenous peoples. Now, amazingly, this process is actually starting. So various Indigenous leaders, such as Benki from the Ashaninka, have made this call that, it's fantastic that, Western science is interested in our medicines, interested in psychedelics, but don't do this without us. And that's not because Indigenous peoples need our help. I mean, obviously they do in terms of reciprocity and certain other financial things and support, but actually what he's saying there is you as Western science need our help, because you're new to this field, you're new to working with these medicines. You don't know what you're doing, but we do, and there are dangers with what you're doing as well. So what does that look like as Western scientists? So I just want to preface this by saying these are my preliminary ideas of what this could look like. Obviously, the first step is to sit down, scientists and Indigenous peoples, and to ask these questions together and to come up with these things together. But these are just my initial thoughts that I wanted to give as examples. And this is definitely not a blueprint on how to do this. This is really an invitation to dialogue and an invitation to get people thinking. So there needs to be, in my opinion, a shift in questions, a shift in the questions that we're asking. So, at the moment, we seem to be asking a lot of questions, and I have in the past, like, does ayahuasca reduce depression, for example? But if we were going to look at this from an Indigenous point of view, from what I've learnt, a much more appropriate question would be, does ayahuasca improve people's connection to spirit, improve people's connection to ancestry? Does it improve your connection to land and your relationship with your community? And then depression is a symptom of that. So we can really think about changing the questions that we're asking. So this is really thinking about how healing takes place from the community's perspective, and it's looking a lot deeper than just symptomatic reduction. So what we really need to be doing here is letting Indigenous worldviews shape the hypothesis, and this has to be done by Indigenous peoples, by Indigenous elders, by people who have experience in these healing modalities. Now, one thing I've been thinking about is, are we imposing frameworks, scientific frameworks, onto these concepts, onto these ways of working that were never meant to hold these experiences? There are big issues with randomized control trials and psychedelics. Maybe they were never meant to work. It was never meant to hold these experiences. And this really asks for epistemic humility. Maybe we, as Western scientists, don't know what the right questions are, and we need to be listening to our Indigenous colleagues to get guidance on that. Okay, so here are some initial ideas that I had for culturally grounded outcome measures. Again, this is not a blueprint, this is just my initial thoughts. I thought that one way that we can do it is through symbolic mapping. So traditional knowledge often emerges through symbols. So I was based in Australia for a while. A way that the Indigenous Australians work is through picture, is through symbol. Same with the Shipibo, with the kuna, and many other Indigenous traditions. So, could we be using visions, art, and song as legitimate data? Can we accept that these are valid data points? How about felt sense data? So, energetics, emotions, ancestral presence, and bodily sensations post-ceremony. These are things in my experience that the Shipibo put a lot of emphasis on. Maybe we could be focusing on these more as well. Perhaps we could be looking at qualitative interviews, so semi-structured interviews that are rooted in Indigenous cosmovisions. So we could use questions and actually create the coding frames that are used to analyze the results from the Indigenous cosmovision, so that when people are given the coding frames in order to analyze the semi-structured interviews, they're doing so from an Indigenous cosmovision. And we need to remember that grounding these things in the cosmovision is the thing that actually gives them meaning. So we need to honor these forms of insights as being just as valid as a psychometric scale, if not more so when in this context. So the next question obviously becomes, how would we actually analyze this? What could that actually look like? So again, some initial ideas that I had would be to co-interpret drawings, stories, and maps with Indigenous elders, with people who are skilled and experienced in this area. We could definitely analyze experiences thematically, but not reductively. So, for example, if somebody in a semi-structured interview said that they were feeling full of light in their chest after the ceremony, instead of coding that in a semi-structured interview as euphoria, we could use a indigenous concept. So, for example, the concept of Jami Niwe, which in Shipibo is the removal of negative energy. So that could be one way that we could think about coding these things in a different way. So again, these analyses need to be based in Western cosmovision, it needs to be based on the Indigenous cosmovision rather than Western psychology. And again, I just want to emphasize, this is designed to complement, not to replace psychometric scales. I'm not saying that we get rid of the Beck's depression inventory and we stop looking at anxiety, and definitely not epigenetics, but we just have this alongside, so it is complementing and is equally as important when we're conducting this research. We also need to think about different ways of representing this data, of representing this research. So scientific papers are fantastic. They're a great way of getting that information out there, but they are not the only way. Other ways that we can do this would be through sharing findings through song, through story, art, oral teaching, in the same way that Indigenous peoples have been doing for millennia. We also need to be recognizing that the ceremonies, lineage, and plants are actually epistemic partners within this research rather than things that we're just using as we do in scientific research. Of course, disseminating that knowledge back to the communities that we're working with is extremely important, and also, if possible, supporting Indigenous-led publications and transmission of the knowledge that we're collecting. So when we start to do this, it really begins to reimagine and rethink science as a form of ceremony. And if we get to do that, then science could become more of an offering rather than an extraction. And in this way, science could become a form of ritual. It could be a process that just isn't as important as the outcome, because we're engaging in a respectful way with our Indigenous colleagues. This is all about building long-term relationships. It's not just going in and doing a particular project. It's all about working in the long term in a way that benefits the Indigenous communities that we're working with. This isn't just about inserting beliefs into science. It's actually about transforming the way that we do science. So it's a new way of conducting science. If we're going to be engaging with these different paradigms, these new to us, we need to have new methods in order to do that. And this requires a form of collaborative inquiry. We need to redefine what counts as valid knowledge, and we need to remember that it's not just Western academia. I just want to end on this question, which is, what would happen if we let the plants lead the science? Now, this might sound very far out to people from a Western scientific background, but if we're going to be working within this paradigm, working with our Indigenous colleagues, in my experience, curanderos let the plants lead everything. They're guided by the plants. It guides them in their healing, it guides them in their everyday life. That's why you do dietas. So it makes complete sense that the science would actually be led with questions that came from dreams, from visions, and from the plants themselves. We really need to start learning from the people who are used to being led by the plants. I'm really interested to see what happens to science if we can engage in a way that allows that to take place. By doing this, we can really honor the mystery of these practices rather than just trying to reduce it into a Western framework. And this really presents science in service of wisdom rather than extracting. Okay, so this is really an invitation to keep questioning, keep reimagining what science could look like, and continue these discussions as much as possible in partnership with different Indigenous colleagues, to keep listening to everything that they have to say. And thank you so much for listening.
We have time for one or two questions. Not to be biased, but I'm going to go over here.
It's more of a comment than a question, but whatever you want to respond to. So thank you so much. It's really wonderful to see psychiatrists getting interested in indigenous shamanism. I guess it's a little bit of a complaint about ignoring anthropology, because there's 100 years of literature of studying indigenous people from anthropological point of view. And a lot of the things you're saying, it's like exactly what anthropologists do. So there's Western science and there's indigenous knowledge, but there's also like sciences inside Western society that have cared for this. And you do a lot of things, like what you're proposing is a lot of things that anthropologists do. For example, since we're talking about different paradigms, let's use native terms that are things that don't translate very well because they represent entirely different paradigms. So, let's try to use the word that they use. And like from the anthropological point of view, it would be like very naive to bring EEG to study like native concepts, because that's totally foreign concept. There's also a discussion called interspecies collaboration or interspecies research, which is exactly this. What would it mean to take it seriously? Native claims that plants are beings, humans, intelligent. So I would try to collaborate with the plants, and I would create this interspecies research. And how would that look like if I ask the plants, what do you want to study? Anyway, I think you are doing great work, and I really applaud you. I suggest you get our book, Ayahuasca Shamanism in the Amazon and Beyond. And we have the Chikrina table. And yeah, the more scientists are interested in this and the more that the psychedelic field embraces these topics, I think we're going to do something better. And maybe there's, an invite for students here in Alaska as well, that you have a lot of native communities like getting interested in these topics, and they can start doing research that is more collaborative and more interdisciplinary. Since ground, I just want to say that I think that's why Alaska is also so cool and ahead of the curve, because there's a lot of opportunity of starting here a psychedelic renaissance that is more plural, more inclusive. As you invite more forms of knowledge, this can start here in Alaska because it's already starting in this higher level than other psychedelic conferences. So I applaud your efforts, Gina efforts, and yeah, everybody that is here. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks so much, Bip. Yeah, no, I totally agree with what you say. I feel that anthropology is the missing puzzle piece. The way that I see it is that there are many different puzzle pieces, and psychiatry coming together with indigenous knowledge is one way that connects together. But I would love to bring in anthropologists into that research as well, because I think that is the missing gap, or at least for the research that I'm doing right now. So maybe we could talk about that afterwards. Yeah.
So, are you proposing to put the soul back into science?
I wish we never took it away. Yeah, totally. I don't think the soul ever left science. I think it's just been dampened a bit. So I'm just talking about reigniting that a little bit. And I think we're on the path to doing that. It is beginning to happen now. So, for example, in Australia, there's some organizations that are beginning to do dyads within psychedelic trials, where it's one indigenous person and one psychotherapist or one psychiatrist, which is really fantastic. But again, that's obviously still within the Western paradigm, because you're not going to be doing exorcisms within, a MAPS MDMA trial, or, not yet, I don't think. So I think it is happening, but it's just baby steps and trying to move forward on that.
Maybe one more question.
It's clear to me that Western industrialized scientific culture has a lot to learn from indigenous traditions. Have you asked your teachers in the indigenous traditions if they feel like there's things that they can learn or are learning from our dysfunctional culture, our largely dysfunctional culture.
Yeah, totally. In a nutshell, battlefield medicine. Battlefield medicine seems to be something that we're much better at in Western science. So if you're in a car crash, if you're in an explosion or something like that, Western science is extremely good at treating those kinds of things. And the Shipibo, at least in my experience, my teachers, they acknowledge that. And they often go to the Western hospital if they have some kind of unfortunate event like that. But anything that's spiritual, most things that are psychological, in my opinion, are dealt with far better by traditional knowledge keepers.
Thank you for that question, and thank you, Simon, for your time. Everyone, please give a really warm round of applause. It takes ridiculous skill to be able to take these two disciplines that have been so siloed against each other and really bring us to not only what a decolonized methodology could look like, but a re-indigenization of our sciences. And I really applaud all of the teachers that have taken Simon under their wing to be able to bring us these new paradigms. We are now going to break for lunch. There's a lot of information to digest. Please also digest some food. And we will rejoin here at 2 p.m. For another beautiful science talk. Thank you.